It was the first week of October in 1988, one of those western Washington autumns that arrives without announcement, the kind where the rain comes back one morning and you understand, in a way that needs no words, that summer is finished and the dark is returning. The mill town of Enumclaw sat 40 miles southeast of Seattle, at the foot of the Cascades, ringed by timber and pasture land, the smell of wood smoke already threading through the neighborhoods by the time the school buses ran in the morning. The mountains were there most days if the clouds cleared, and when they did, Mount Rainier filled the eastern sky the way nothing else in the state could, enormous and white and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. Kevin Brower had lived in Enumclaw his entire life. He was 31 years old and worked the day shift at the Weyerhaeuser Mill on the south side of town, the same mill his father had worked for 22 years before a back injury took him out in 1979. Kevin had grown up watching his father leave for that mill in the dark and come home smelling of sawdust and machine oil, and he had followed that same road without hesitation. Because in a town like Enumclaw in the 1980s, the mill was not just a job, it was the architecture that held everything else in place. It was where men like Kevin's father and Kevin himself understood what they were for. He had a wife named Diane and a son named Marcus, who was 4 years old and had recently developed an obsession with dinosaurs that Kevin quietly shared without admitting it. He coached youth soccer on Saturday mornings. He had a 1984 Chevy pickup in dark blue that he kept cleaner than most people kept their houses. He and Diane had moved into a house on Griffin Avenue 2 years earlier, a modest 2-bedroom on a quiet street with a fenced yard that Marcus could run in, and they were in the way of young families who have just gotten their footing in the world, steadily and quietly happy. On the evening of October 7th, 1988, Kevin left the Elks Lodge on Cole Street at 9:45 after a monthly meeting that had run long. He had told Diane he'd be home by 9. She had the answering machine on by the time he called from the payphone outside the lodge to let her know he was on his way. He said he'd pick up a VH from the video rental store on Roosevelt if they were still open. She said she'd stay up. He said he loved her. She heard the coin drop and the line go quiet. No one who knew him would ever see him again. Kevin's truck was found the following morning at 6:20 by a county road crew, parked on a gravel pull-off along a logging road 3 miles east of town, on the edge of the Natchez Trail corridor. The engine was off, the door was unlocked, his jacket was on the passenger seat. The VH rental receipt from Videoland on Roosevelt Avenue was in the cup holder. He had stopped, as he'd told Diane he would, at 9:58. He had rented a copy of Crocodile Dundee II. The receipt was time-stamped. He had been alive at 9:58. The King County Sheriff's Office was the lead investigative agency for the unincorporated land where Kevin's truck was found, though the Enumclaw Police Department coordinated on the missing persons end. A search was organized through the Natchez Trail corridor on October 8th and 9th. Volunteers from the mill, from Kevin's soccer league, from the Elks Lodge, turned out in numbers that the county search coordinator described as exceptional. More than 200 people walked those trails across 2 days. Kevin Brower's body was found on October 10th, in a creek drainage 400 yards off the logging road. He had been killed. The manner was consistent with a blunt force attack. There were no signs of robbery. His wallet was in his jacket pocket, $43 still inside. Detective Sergeant Paul Whitman of the King County Sheriff's Office took the lead. He was 44 years old, a former Army MP who had worked homicide for 11 years, and had, by his own later account, never worked a case in a community that pulled together the way Enumclaw pulled together around the Brower family. People brought food to Diane's house every day for 3 weeks. The Youth Soccer League held a collection for her and Marcus. The mill gave her 6 months of Kevin's salary as a hardship payment that had no formal precedent in their personnel policies. They just did it. Because that was the kind of place Enumclaw was. Whitman's investigation in the weeks following Kevin's death moved along 2 tracks simultaneously. The first was the video rental store. The Videoland receipt placed Kevin alive at 9:58. The store had a security camera, a black and white VH surveillance system mounted above the register. The kind that ran on a continuous 4-hour tape that the owner recorded over every few days. Crucially, he had not recorded over the October 7th tape. It had been sitting in a box behind the counter. Whitman took it into evidence on October 9th. The tape showed Kevin at the counter at 9:58, exactly as the receipt confirmed. It showed him leave through the front door at 10:02. It showed, in the 11 minutes that followed before the tape's 4-hour loop ended, 2 other customers entering the store. And, visible in the background through the store's front window, a vehicle parked across the street that had not been there when Kevin arrived. The vehicle was dark-colored. It appeared to be a sedan or a small truck. The image quality was poor, the grain of a 1988 surveillance tape playing on a 1988 monitor. And despite Whitman's best efforts, the tape yielded nothing more specific. The make could not be determined. The license plate was not visible. The vehicle left the frame 2 minutes after Kevin did, in the same direction Kevin had turned. That tape, and what it almost showed, would become the central frustration of the next 3 decades. The second track of Whitman's investigation focused on Kevin's life and relationships. He had no known enemies, no debts, no disputes, but one name surfaced in interviews, carefully and cautiously, from 2 separate people who had known Kevin through the mill. A man named Douglas Hale, who had worked at the Weyerhaeuser mill with Kevin until a workplace dispute in 1987 ended with Hale's dismissal. Hale had, according to both sources, held Kevin partially responsible, not because Kevin had done anything improper, but because Kevin had been the shift supervisor whose incident report had triggered the HR process that led to the termination. Hale was interviewed by Whitman in late October of 1988. He had an alibi for the evening of October 7th. He had been at a bar in Auburn with 3 friends, a claim supported by a signed credit card receipt and 2 witnesses. The alibi was solid. Hale was removed from consideration. By January of 1989, the investigation had reached the wall that cold cases hit when the evidence runs out before the answers do. The surveillance tape sat in evidence storage. The physical materials from the creek drainage, hair, fiber, soil samples were in the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. The dark vehicle in the background of 11 minutes of grainy videotape remained unidentified. Diane Brower moved to Tacoma in 1991 with Marcus, who was 7 by then, and had begun asking questions she didn't yet know how to answer. She kept Kevin's photo on the mantelpiece. She kept the case file number written on a piece of paper in her desk drawer. Not because she needed it. She had memorized it in the first month, but because having it written somewhere felt like a form of keeping faith. By 1995, Paul Whitman had retired from the King County Sheriff's Office. He did not keep his cases in his desk the way Roy Alderman had in Missouri. He kept them differently. He ran 5 miles every morning, and he thought about them while he ran. And certain cases came back to him on certain mornings with a clarity that felt almost like being back at the scene. Kevin Brower was one of those cases. The Videoland tape was one of those images. A dark vehicle, visible for 2 minutes, through a plate glass window on Roosevelt Avenue, and then gone. By 2000, Marcus Brower was 16 and had grown into a young man his mother said looked more like his father every year, which was both the most comforting and most difficult thing she could say about him. He knew everything about the case that Diane knew, which was nearly everything Whitman had been willing to share in the years when Marcus was old enough to ask. By 2010, 22 years had passed. The Videoland store on Roosevelt Avenue had closed in 1997 as video rental stores across the country slowly gave way to something else. The building was now a nail salon. Douglas Hale, the cleared suspect from 1988, had moved to Eastern Washington and eventually died in 2009, taking his alibi to the grave along with everything else he knew. Marcus Brower, now 26, filed a public records request with the King County Sheriff's Office in 2011, requesting the complete case file on his father's death. He received it in 3 installments over 6 months. He read every page. And then he did something that would eventually change everything. He scanned the entire file and uploaded it to a cloud storage account, where it sat alongside the one thing he had specifically requested and received a copy of, the original Videoland surveillance tape, transferred to digital format by the county's records unit in 2009 as part of a routine evidence preservation effort. The digital file sat in Marcus's cloud storage for 11 years. He returned to it the way his grandfather had returned to the mill, steadily, without drama, because it was the thing he had decided he was for. Every case we cover on this channel exists because someone refused to close the drawer. If these stories matter to you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. You'd be surprised how far this community reaches. Now let's get back to Enumclaw. In the spring of 2023, Marcus Brower was 39 years old and working as an IT project manager in Seattle. He was not a forensic specialist. He was not a detective, but he had spent 12 years watching what technology could do to old images, and in early 2023, he read an article about law enforcement agencies using AI-powered video enhancement software to recover detail from degraded surveillance footage. Software built on the same underlying architecture as the image upscaling tools that had become commercially available in recent years, refined for forensic application. He contacted the King County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit directly. He sent them the article. He sent them the digital copy of the Videoland tape. He asked them to look at what the software might be able to do with the vehicle in the background. A cold case detective named Rachel Sung was assigned the file in June of 2023. She submitted the footage to the Washington State Patrol's Digital Forensics Unit, which had access to the AI enhancement platform Marcus had identified. The process works by training an algorithm on thousands of hours of similar low-resolution video to reconstruct probable detail from degraded pixels, not inventing information, but statistically recovering what the original image almost certainly contained. It cannot produce certainty, but it can produce enough. On a Thursday morning in August of 2023, Rachel Sung received the enhanced frames. She pulled them up on her monitor and leaned forward in her chair. The vehicle in the background of the Videoland window was now identifiable. It was a 1985 or 1986 Ford Ranger pickup, dark green, with a toolbox mounted behind the cab. The kind of aftermarket toolbox that contractors and tradespeople used throughout the 1980s. And in the enhanced image of the final frame, before the truck left the frame, a partial plate was visible. 2 letters and 1 number, the right side of a Washington state license plate. It took 4 days of cross-referencing DMV records from the relevant year range to produce a manageable list. It took another 2 weeks to work through that list against the geographic constraints, owners who had lived in or regularly traveled to the Enumclaw area in October of 1988. And at the end of that process, one name remained that had not been there before. One name that connected every thread. Raymond Colby. In 1988, Raymond Colby had been 43 years old. He had lived in Black Diamond, 8 miles from Enumclaw, and he had worked as a deputy with the King County Sheriff's Office for 16 years. He had been one of the first responders to the call on October 8th, when Kevin Brower's truck was found on the logging road. His name appeared 4 times in the original case file, each time in his capacity as a responding deputy, nothing more. He had interviewed 2 of the volunteer searchers. He had helped establish the perimeter on the day Kevin's body was found. He had spent the 35 years since doing exactly what Paul Whitman and Roy Alderman and every investigator in these cases never expected a killer to do. Nothing. He had retired from the sheriff's office in 2004 with a commendation for 32 years of service. He had coached Little League in Black Diamond for 8 years. He was, by every measure available to the people around him, a decent man who had given his working life to the public good. He was 78 years old when Rachel Sung's team knocked on his door. The arrest of Raymond Colby on September 19, 2023, was made at his home in Black Diamond at 7:15 in the morning by detectives from the King County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit, accompanied by officers from the Black Diamond Police Department. He answered the door in work clothes. He had been up since 6. His neighbor would later tell the local paper. Because he always had been, his whole life. Old habits from the department. He looked at the badges. He looked at the arrest warrant. According to the lead detective's report, he did not say he didn't know what they were talking about. He did not protest. He looked at Rachel Sung for a long moment, and then he asked if he could get his jacket. The community reaction in Black Diamond and Enumclaw moved through the 4 stages that the worst revelations always produce. Shock first, disbelief close behind it, and then, when the disbelief ran out of room to stand, something quieter and colder and harder to name. A man who had worked the case, who had stood at the perimeter the day Kevin's body was found, who had sat across interview tables from people trying to find answers and offered them nothing. The commendation on his wall. The Little League years. The 32 years of service. A law enforcement source told a Seattle newspaper that the physical evidence, hair fiber recovered from the creek drainage in 1988 and reanalyzed using modern techniques, produced a DNA match to Colby when compared against the database maintained for law enforcement employees. The toolbox on the Ranger. A distinctive gouge in the toolbox's left corner, visible in the enhanced frame, that matched a toolbox photographed in a 1991 home insurance assessment of Colby's Black Diamond property. A motive took longer to establish, and its dimensions emerged gradually through the investigation. Kevin Brower, it turned out, had seen something he was not supposed to see. Court documents filed in 2024 described a scheme in which property from crime scenes in the Enumclaw Black Diamond corridor had been systematically removed before inventory, equipment, tools, items of value, by a deputy who had learned, over 16 years, exactly how evidence was cataloged and what could disappear without generating questions. Kevin had encountered Colby in circumstances that, the prosecution argued, left Colby with no choice but to act quickly and decisively. Kevin was a man who would have reported what he saw. Raymond Colby knew that about him. In a town where everyone knew everyone, Colby understood exactly what kind of man Kevin Brower was. Raymond Colby was charged with first-degree murder in November of 2023. He pleaded not guilty. As of the recording of this video, The case is proceeding toward trial in King County Superior Court. He remains in custody. Diane Brower, who had moved back to the Enumclaw area in 2018 to be closer to Marcus and his family, received the call from Rachel Sung on the morning of September 19th, before the arrest was made public. She sat in her kitchen and she listened. And when Sung finished speaking, she said, according to Sung, who shared this in a recorded interview for the King County Sheriff's press materials, that she had always believed it would come. That she had never stopped believing it. That Kevin had been a man who deserved for it to come. Marcus Brower, the 4-year-old boy with the dinosaur obsession who had grown up to become the person who cracked his father's case open, did not speak to the press on the day of the arrest. He issued a short written statement. It read, in part, that his father had been a man who showed up for his family, for his community, for the people who needed him, and that it had taken 35 years, but the people who needed to show up for his father finally had. There is something specific about this case that does not appear often in cold case investigations, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The person who broke it open was not a detective, and was not a forensic specialist, and was not a journalist or an advocate. He was a son who had been 4 years old when his father was killed, who had grown up with a cloud storage folder and a determination that the grainy image of a dark truck in a plate glass window was eventually going to tell him something. He taught himself enough about the technology to know who to call. And he made the call. That matters. It matters because it means that the tools available now, the AI-enhanced video, the DNA reanalysis, the digital preservation of evidence that would otherwise degrade, are not only in the hands of institutions. They are available to the people who love the ones who were lost. And that changes something about who gets to pursue justice, and how, and for how long. Kevin Brower was 31 years old. He coached youth soccer on Saturday mornings and kept his truck cleaner than most people kept their houses, and was going to stop at the video rental store on the way home, because he'd said he would. He had a son who was 4 years old and obsessed with dinosaurs, and he had told his wife he loved her on a payphone outside the Elks Lodge, and the coin had dropped, and the line had gone quiet, and he had not come home. 35 years is a long time to carry a cloud storage folder. Marcus Brower carried it all the way. What do you think about the role that private citizens, families, not professionals, are increasingly playing in breaking cold cases, using the same tools available to investigators? And what does it say about the particular horror of this case, that the man who stood at the crime scene perimeter was the one who had created it? Leave your thoughts in the comments. These are the questions this community thinks most carefully about, and I want to hear where you land. Justice came for Kevin Brower after 35 years. It came because his son refused to let a grainy videotape be the last word. If you believe that persistence in the face of silence is its own kind of justice, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are waiting for you in the description. Thank you for watching.